Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of our Queer Disrupt podcast. We are back finally, and I just want to apologise for the delay between the publication of this episode and the previous ones. We are completely redoing the way we do our podcasts, so there's lots going on behind the scenes, and we are, at the moment of editing at least, in full conference flow to get that underway for everyone. We do have a few more podcasts coming out in this kind of standalone single episode way upcoming, but we are looking at moving into mini seasons moving forward. So a short series of 4 to 6 podcast episodes that allow us to really get into some of the more interesting topics. These will hopefully be launched later in the year, as we will be getting underway over summer after our conference, which, by the way, do check out on careerdisrupt.com. And on our Eventbrite. And we recently have had to expand the amount of tickets we have available due to popular demand. We currently, at the time when we're recording this, have nearly 500 tickets kind of released to everyone and people who have signed up for. And in it we have some amazing keynote speakers. We have Professors Jack Halberstam and Heather Love talking about the aesthetics of collapse and queer disruption before and after. But Today, I'm joined by Ben Paites, and we're looking at pirates, more specifically queer pirates. We are looking at cross-dressing, gangs of vagabonds, queer marriages, debauched party boats of prostitutes, the origin of the word Matey, and much, much, much more. Just a small content note, it's nothing serious, don't worry. We do say, I say a queer slur in this particular episode. It is in context, but listening back, it did come kind of surprisingly out of nowhere. Just want to give you all that heads up. So hopefully it's all okay, and I'm not just throwing it around casually. I promise it is in context. But if you still want to stick around, hang around and listen to this episode of the Queer Disrupts podcast, and I will not apologise for this title, nor the awful accent coming up, but this episode is called ARRR, Where's Me Matey's Booty? Queer Pirates on the High Seas.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Queer Disrupts podcast. I'm back! You probably thought you got rid of me, and I can only apologise that my slightly nasal and irritating voice has returned to your airways and all of your wonderful subscriptions. Since the last time I did a podcast, we have grown loads, and I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who is following and listening and doing amazing things and liking us. I feel like I've turned finally into one of those YouTube people or like podcasts who I promised myself I'd never turn into. And I was like, please like, subscribe and comment. So please like, subscribe and comment and all of that. Oh, it felt so alien and weird to me. It felt like, oh my God, the neoliberal capitalist system is sucking me in and I can't get out. I'm actually here today as the person who has no idea what we're talking about. So this is going to be like a kind of nice little talk through time. I've reached the limit of my knowledge now talking about this. I think it's something to do with prisoners and gay pirates, both of which sounded right up my alley, pun intended. So, I will pass you over to my wonderful speaker I've got with us today, called Ben. I'm not going to try and introduce them because I imagine Ben will do a significantly better job of introducing themselves. Over to you, Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Paites. I'm one of the curators at Colchester Museums. So my job as a curator kind of involves doing research and stuff for exhibitions, running events, and kind of doing schools activities and things. But I've been doing over the last few years quite a lot of research into the collections in Colchester Museums, and particularly looking at LGBT history that we can tell through those. So it's taken me on a kind of mad tour of all sorts of different periods that I'm not comfortable with. My period of kind of specialism is the Romans. Colchester is renowned for its Roman archaeology. But as Nick mentioned, I'm going to be talking about pirates and prisons and lots of other things that are completely different to what I'm used to kind of talking about. But particularly the last year has kind of brought some of these subjects to my attention, and I've kind of on social media and things have tweeted about some of these things, and people have found it interesting. So I thought, well, you know what? Clearly, there's an interest in queer pirates, and so let's learn a bit more about them.
You have no idea how excited. In my mind, I've got Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean. Is that what it was like? Are we expecting
Jack is a common name in amongst pirates. So yeah, there's they were flamboyant.
Yay!
So this is the kind of thing. The perceptions of pirates have changed in media quite a bit over the last 100 years or so. If you think of kind of early films and things, kind of Blackbeard and that kind of stuff, black and white movies, pirates were seen as a certain type of thing, very vicious, very masculine, very kind of all these kind of stereotypes of pirates. But actually they were people, and so they were very diverse, just like we are. And in fact, a lot of the time, if you think about it, pirates were living on the fringes of society, so they automatically attracted those already living on the fringes of society, and that includes queer people. There's a whole narrative that I'm going to talk about in terms of how someone might have ended up in a pirate crew. But yeah, there's particularly in the 18th century when the kind of the golden age of piracy happened. Although legally and kind of societally, there were certain perspectives and things on same-sex relationships and sex and stuff. But in practice, of course, as always, things were very different to the kind of public perception.
Okay, because my public perception at the minute is Captain Pugwash and Roger the cabin boy. That was it.
That's how it started.
Yeah. I mean, I guess enlighten me. I might pop in and ask questions, but yeah, talk to me. Give me the deeds.
Yeah, so I wanted to start off talking a little bit about as historians, as another thing, I'm an archaeologist in my background, so not even historian. I started off in digging holes, if that were how you describe it. But I kind of went from archaeology into museums, and my kind of opinion of what archaeology is telling stories through objects. So that's kind of the approach that I've taken with a lot of the work that I've been doing over the years, is looking at objects and how they can tell the stories that might not normally be told in museums and heritage sites and galleries and things. And particularly with pirates, I've had to do this because we have nothing relating to pirates in Colchester Museums, but I absolutely love the story of pirates. So I've tried to use other things to kind of springboard onto these discussions when I give tours and things. But there is this idea, and you'll speak to any queer historian, whether they be a queer historian or a historian of queer history, they will have different perspectives on how we approach this idea of terminology in the past. So we talk about gay pirates, bi pirates, words like gay, bisexual, that didn't exist before kind of the 1800s. So we would still use them nowadays. If I was giving a tour to members of the public, those are the words I would use because that would be the words they're familiar with. But in terms of describing the relationships that existed in the past, they were probably a bit more complex than that. My familiarity with this, as I said, is mostly with the Romans. So with the Romans, not only was it to do with your genitals, it was to do with what kind of class you were within society, what role you took within that relationship, and all those sorts of things. So it wasn't just as simple as he was gay, she was a lesbian. It was kind of like how you fitted in within the societal structure of sexual relationships. And similarly, kind of later on, that sort of continued in that the nature of same-sex relationships in much later periods was affected by your status. So you could kind of get away with it perhaps a bit more in, as I said, on the fringes of society with groups of people who were perhaps seen as lower down. It wouldn't be so much of a kind of an issue if you were having same-sex relationships. It's those in positions of power, and where it's more conspicuous, perhaps, we have historical records of accusations and punishment and things like that for same-sex relationships.
So what terminology do you use then? What's your approach to it, I guess?
Yeah, so what I tend to say for kind of sexuality, I talk about same-sex relationships. So if we have an account of a man having sex with a man, I'll say it's a same-sex relationship because we don't know whether that person has slept with women before or will sleep with women afterwards. Similarly, with discussions around gender identity and things in the past, I talk about gender non-conforming. So it's quite easy for people to say, oh, here's a historical trans person, which is great because we need to have trans representation in history. But the nature of kind of gender as it existed in the past is very different to how we perceive it today. So the fact that a person who was biologically male dressed as a woman, or who is biologically a woman who dressed as a man specifically, which I'll talk about more later, isn't necessarily them being trans as we understand it today. It was them fitting into what was expected of them within society, or kind of going against that in various ways.
Okay, now that makes more sense. The queer theorist in me was cringing at the biological male and biological female.
Sounds weird for me to say. We can't look at genitals in the past. So there is no discussion of genitals in the past. It's entirely.
Did you not see Pompeii? Sorry, this is my ignorance. Is Pompeii Roman?
Yes.
Did you not see the wanking man?
Yeah, he's not, but yeah.
No, let me have my wanking historical.
But that is interesting. So although you might not have written records, you have, in some periods, you have sculpture and things like that. So the Romans are a good example. When we talk about gender non-conforming and things like that, you have hermaphrodite statues, you have all of these kind of things, and you have the cult of Cybele, which we know about, whose priests were men who kind of presented as women as part of this priesthood.
Okay, so we've got this kind of history of things. I kind of really want to know, though, sorry, just to go back quickly. If that man wasn't wanking, what was he doing? Because I have seen that. That man's penis is well in his hand. He is having a great time.
Well, I guess when you get confronted by a massive volcanic eruption, I guess you can't control your body necessarily in terms of how the positions. I mean, you look at some of the other people who have been preserved. They are in different positions that aren't natural. So perhaps that was something that happened. I mean, it could be he was wanking. We don't know. With archaeology, we don't know a lot of.
Let's just queer the history of masturbation.
Yeah, that's where it began. The first recorded instance.
Let's talk about pirates.
Yes.
Again, give me the details. So we've kind of clarified what kind of terminology we can and can't use, or at least how you're using it rather than we can or can't use.
Yes.
So what should I know?
So the history of kind of the acceptance, tolerance, however one wants to look at it, of same-sex relationships throughout history is quite a diverse one. And in terms of legislation and things like that, I'll mention I'm talking mostly about the United Kingdom and specifically England, really, in this, is the Buggery Act of 1533, which didn't just include buggery as we think of it today. It was basically anything that wasn't procreative sex was seen as illegal. Now, what's interesting is you kind of look at how this was taken throughout history after that point and the nature of punishment that was given out. So the severity of a crime can often be kind of deduced by the type of punishment that was usually given out. So, for example, heresy, they usually got executed. And this was often on the most tenuous of examples.
Just for clarity's sake, what do you mean by heresy?
In this instance, going against the kind of religion of the day. So, for example, Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church. Everyone has to be Protestant now. So if you decided to keep being Catholic or anything else, you could be executed. But under the Buggery Act, a lot of the times, the lowest possible form of punishment was applied. Now, it still wasn't nice. So this was being pilloried. Now, being pilloried is where you're basically tied to a post so that the public can laugh at you, throw stuff at you, do whatever, and basically to make an example of you. And there are also examples of especially kind of higher status people, just probably bribery rather than fines, but paying off any accusations to kind of make them go away.
I mentioned this briefly in one of the lectures I gave, and I stressed in that as well, pillorying really is not nice. No. People would have things thrown at them to the point where they were black and blue and bones were broken. It's not a case of just being tied up and left to your own devices. It could be quite a brutal punishment at times.
Yeah, and they would often tour them around as well. They would take them to different places to make sure that they were seen in different areas. So it was an awful thing to have to suffer. And so we know that there are these kind of instances of people being punished. Now, the one thing that I found interesting in relation to the Buggery Act in my area in Colchester when I was doing my research, not that it really adds anything to history in a sense in terms of our understanding, but when you're looking at some of the records, and this might just be Essex, I don't know, but looking at some of the records of people accused of buggery, the only time you know this precise crime, so as I mentioned, the Buggery Act covers a lot of different things that wasn't procreative sex. The only time you know of the precise crime is when it's bestiality. So bestiality, they mention the animal colour, the size, the owner, all of this information. It's very in-depth records they have of these kind of cases. But everything else, I mean, we have people accused of buggery, but it could have been masturbation. It could have been kind of a man having anal sex with a woman. It could have been a whole host of different things. So it doesn't necessarily mean same-sex relationships. This is kind of one of the issues when looking at kind of 16th and 17th century kind of cases around this. At least, like I say, at least that's what it is in Essex. I'm not sure if other places have more in-depth records, maybe. So it's been difficult doing the research in this area to find names of people who perhaps would have been accused of these crimes. But we know, as I've kind of mentioned before, it's the people on the fringes of society that end up on these pirate ships. So in the 18th century, which was when the height of the age of piracy kind of existed, There had been kind of a developing kind of boom in population. Family sizes were quite large, and younger men in particular, young boys, families couldn't look after.
Give me an age, sorry.
This will be kind of potentially from kind of 5 or 8 upwards.
Oh my God.
Like very young children been kind of sent out, whether to go into servitude sometimes when they're a bit older to go into apprenticeships. But in a lot of instances, we know that the children, the boys, would not have kind of either they would have been too young or like kind of not got on with this, and many tried to escape. And you have this contingent of what are described, so this isn't me, they're described as vagabonds or vagrants who were kind of wandering around England at the time. And there's one account that says there could have been up to 30,000 at kind of one moment. And they were kind of seen as kind of outcasts.
When you say like servitude, then what kind of servitude are we talking about here?
Yeah, so this is kind of what you think of as a kind of upstairs downstairs servitude. So this isn't quite slavery, though it's on the cusp. So this is kind of indentured servitude, where you will live with a family, they will feed you, they will house you, so as a child you would do things like keep the fires going or like kind of menial tasks around the house.
So like chimney sweeping almost.
Yeah, that sort of stuff. But with one specific household. So rather than wandering around doing this, a family would, in essence, own you, sort of, and you would do all of the tasks that needed to be done within the household with other servants of different ages. So you might have been trained up. So you might have kind of had an older servant who would kind of train you in certain skills so that eventually one day you might be able to leave. But the idea is that the families who did this, who gave their children away, didn't have the income or the kind of resources they could have had more than 10 children sometimes, and so they didn't have the resources to look after them. So that was what happened. And what is often the case is that these were boys. So girls would be married off, again very young, younger than we would kind of expect them to be, or they could be sent off into servitude as well sometimes. But it seems to be the boys were the ones most likely to end up leaving those places and ended up wandering with these gangs in England for whatever reason. So the point is that these gangs ended up being predominantly male. And so these predominantly male gangs made up of very young boys.
So again, when we're saying like these gangs of young boys, are we still talking like 8-year-olds?
It could be that young.
And how big are these gangs? Are we like 3 or 4? Are we talking gangs of thousands, like roaming the country?
Think of, for anyone who's seen it, kind of Oliver Twist and Fagin's gang and that kind of stuff. Like Fagin, kind of old man with a load of young boys. That's a whole other thing that we're not going to look into. But that was the sort of size, like maybe 10 groups of people that would wander around. They would often kind of stay by the coast, because one of the other things, and this is where we eventually get into pirates, is one of the other things that would happen is in times of war, in times of kind of need, is that as a young unemployed person, you could go to the coast and get recruited onto the Navy or merchant vessels or things like that for temporary periods of time to earn a little bit of money, come back to England, and then go about doing whatever you were doing before.
So you say like in like times of need and stuff. Outside of times of need, sorry, I'm fascinated by these like Roman gangs of like pubescent boys, like just sort of causing chaos. Like, how were they like surviving? Like, were they thieving or what?
Well, begging would have been one thing. There would have been older boys as well, so they would have experienced it before and kind of taught them how to kind of survive. And yeah, it would have been very tough because, as you say, it's kind of there's nothing. You've got nothing. You're kind of wandering around trying to kind of find anything, whether it's probably not even money. They were just looking for food and water and shelter. But the kind of key thing is that these were pretty much all male groups. And so growing up as a young boy, your only experience of social interactions is with other young boys. And so it's believed that there was this kind of institutionalized, like, again, because they're very young, we're not going to talk about sex, but homo-romantic maybe kind of relationships that developed amongst younger ones that eventually might have developed into sexual relationships as they got older. But living in that kind of society, that kind of grouping, that was more easily accepted and encouraged almost.
That's crazy, because that kind of reminds me of there's a fantastic, problematic but fantastic look at scene in Paris is Burning, which is where my own research sits with drag, where very early on there's a 13 and a 15-year-old boy who are basically street boys, and they behave in what would, I think, be fairly assumed they are a couple. I mean, I think one literally has like hickeys on their neck, so you can assume they are at least in some level sexually active. It's probably clear where we sit in terms of like morality in terms of these things. So like, I think when discussing this, I think, yeah, we can avoid that conversation. I think it's fair to say that by modern standards, this would not in any way be acceptable. But it is the kind of reality that you were talking about there. I just wanted to ask as well quickly, whilst we're on the topic of these like vagabond gangs, you mentioned like older boys. When we're saying older, are we talking like, I mean, I'm nearly 30. Would I be an quote older boy? What happens, I guess, when you graduate from the gang, or do you not?
I think often by the time you get to kind of late teens, early 20s, from what I've seen, is that you'd end up getting some sort of employ. You would either, like I say, join the Navy, go onto ships, even if it's a kind of temporary kind of gig economy type, as if you want to use a modern equivalence type thing, or you would end up being an apprentice eventually. You would find someone who would take you on. There was a surprisingly high demand for servants, like I say, at the time. This isn't just like fancy pants high up royalty that would have servants. You'd have people at quite a few different levels within society that would have people what we consider as servants in their household doing jobs and things. So there was always a chance to kind of get that. But the issue with these people is that there is very little historical evidence for them other than what other people have written about them. So you're more likely to notice a big gaggle of 8-year-olds running around homeless than you would maybe an adult man wandering around with them or kind of near them or whatever. So our perception of what these gangs were like is entirely based on other people's observations.
So yeah, of course, yeah, you make the fair point there that these 8-year-olds are not writing history. They're not writing their own stories down. Aside from the fact that they wouldn't have interest, I imagine, because, you know, slightly more important things going on in their life, like, you know, trying to live, but also literally the means, even if it was a consideration. I mean, I can't imagine any of these boys could like read or write at anything what we would call a level of literacy that we would hold now for an 8-year-old.
No, literally, literacy was so low at that point anyway, but specifically the families they would have come from, there would have been nothing. There wouldn't have been a need for them. Yeah, there wasn't the kind of institutionalized schooling that we have nowadays that developed much later on. It's kind of, you learn what your parents tell you, and if you're wealthy enough, you would have a schooling education. But
like
yeah,
it was tutor.
Yeah, that's basically what it was. So at this point, you were kind of not very well educated, looking just to survive, basically. But like I say, you would often end up heading towards the coast because that's where you have a higher chance of employment through the Navy. And then potentially you would end up in piracy, which is an interesting thing because piracy originally wasn't illegal or a crime. It was actively encouraged.
Immediately, I was about to jump in and ask you, like, so obviously we have this kind of very stereotypical yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum kind of pirate shippy Blackbeard. I mentioned Captain Pugwash, tongue-in-cheek earlier, buried treasure and stuff. And then obviously narratives around piracy have obviously developed. And I honestly don't know enough to sort of hold any kind of truth to this, but we get stories on Somali pirates, for example. There was a film with Tom Hanks with that. So you immediately mentioned, you know, it was encouraged. Like, can you give me, like, I guess, a very brief overview of what piracy was and what it meant and what its function was, I guess, of that time?
Yeah. So in essence, what a pirate is someone who owns a ship or a crew who own a ship who go and steal stuff from other ships. In the kind of its most basic, that's what kind of pirates are kind of perceived as, and that's what they did. So initially, what we're talking about the period of empire building. We're talking about people had recently from kind of Europe had recently gone to the Americas. It was at this time where you have kind of especially Spain, Britain, France, kind of trying to expand, and Africa as well, trying to expand their trade networks, trying to kind of get greater wealth across the world. And there was a constant competition between all of these countries to who could get the most, who could get the furthest, who could discover the most kind of bountiful sources of gold, silver, whatever. And so what happened is you'd get these privateers, these kind of smaller state-owned vessels that would go off and try and get the wealth from those other countries sailing around.
So it was literally state-sanctioned piracy?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
So you could say, oh, I'm doing this on behalf of the crown. I'm going to steal this gold from the Spanish, take it back to Britain, take a cut for myself, give the king, queen, whoever it was at the time, some of what we've got.
So essentially they were bounty hunters of a sort.
Yeah, not of specific individuals, but of ship.
Yeah, they were literally hunting bounty. I mean, in its most basic form. Yeah.
Or booty, we like to say if it's pirates, because we're getting onto gay stuff in a minute. But there became these established places where you would know to go to. So that's why the Caribbean became so renowned, and why we have the Pirates of the Caribbean is because that was a place where you could go to, and there was this constant interaction between all of these ships the Spanish, the French, the British were all kind of sailing around these areas trying to get resources back to their own countries.
In my mind, pirates are extremely violent. I cannot imagine in any way this bounty being claimed from other ships in any way gently. Were they?
Yeah, they burn the ships to the ground sometimes. It depends on the conflict. So obviously this was very dangerous work as well for them. You could engage with a ship and they could blow you out the water. You don't know how it's going to turn out. The prospect of wealth, gold, whatever it was enough at that time to encourage people. And even the most famous of pirates, the most kind of renowned people that we know, Blackbeard, etc. Blackbeard only operated for a couple of years before he was killed. He wasn't kind of around for that long. Even then, the golden age of piracy, it was only a kind of decade or so. It wasn't a long period of time. It's because it was so violent and so dangerous. A lot of these kind of key figures weren't able to survive. However, a few of the people that I did want to talk about today, they did survive a little bit longer, but that's mainly because they kind of either gave up on piracy, whether short term or for the rest of their lives, or kind of found a way around it. And the early 1600s, it was kind of seen as okay. But as we get towards the end of the 1600s and into the 1700s, that's when it became illegal. And it's in the early 1700s, which is when the golden age of piracy was.
This is kind of blowing my mind a little bit. So you just have these young boys. Sorry, I'm still on the vagabond gang. Recruited onto this pirate ship. And people were like, yes, this is okay.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't have recruited the youngest ones. They recruited kind of seafaringable young boys. So boys or men. You could have been any age, but as long as you were able to do work on a ship, it was fine. Yeah, they weren't like crews of 5-year-old boys sailing the seas. It was more like you would have a fully fledged adult male pirate crew with a couple of children who have been recruited.
Yeah, like Crow's Nest and all that lot.
Yeah.
I don't know, I guess it's the kind of utter casual disregard for human life.
Yeah, but I guess because for these people, as we've already mentioned, they're already kind of at the extremes of society. They're already in desperate need. There's just as much risk staying on land as there would be going out to sea. But there's greater potential going out to sea. You could get loads of gold. You could get trained in skills of seamanship, etc. And then you get to see the world. You get to see the Caribbean and travel around and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, pirates started off as kind of accepted. Then it became more and more not allowed. And that's when you start to see, like I say, this kind of people from the fringes of society would start to join these pirate crews. But equally, the Navy as well. This is something I'm not as familiar with, but I know there are accounts of same-sex kind of relationships in the Navy. So although it was, again, illegal on land, at sea, it's kind of like, well, we can't do anything, so just let them carry on. We know there was, I can't remember the name of the person, but there was a kind of in Britain anyway, there was a person who ended up going onto a ship to kind of sail to the Americas, I think, and went on a Navy ship to do it and wrote an account of basically everyone was shagging each other and how horrific it was. And we know that wealthier people would tend to prefer to travel on merchant ships than Navy ships because there was this reputation that in the Navy, as today, that there was this kind of ongoing men having sex with each other.
Oh my God, that's really cool. So really cool. As if I'm ever going to join the Navy in the 1700s and join this party boat or something. But so the merchant ships, I imagine it was safer as well.
No, the merchant ships were more likely to get attacked by the pirates.
So you would actually choose to go on something that potentially was higher risk just to avoid, I don't know, them queers shagging next to you in the bunk.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I love it. This sounds amazing.
Yeah. And this is anecdotal kind of accounts from people. And it might have been one ship. There might have been one ship sailing around of debauchery that all these wealthy bigwigs from Britain happened to go on and were like, oh my God, what's going on? But yeah, but we can extrapolate and assume that because these were all male kind of societies, that it was more accepted, especially when you were at sea for weeks and weeks, months sometimes.
So it was a situational thing then?
Yes. So situational sexuality is something as well that I've kind of been doing some research into. So on a slight tangent, we had a prisoner of war camp in Colchester. So during the Second World War, there were German prisoners of war kept just outside the town. And although they had quite a kind of, relatively speaking, positive relationship with the town, we know of accounts of them playing football with the town's people. They set up their own football teams and they had this kind of friendly competition while it was going on. There is also anecdotal, once again, accounts of same-sex relationships happening between people within the camp. So Ken Free wrote a book a little while ago called Camp 186, The Lost Town at Beerchurch, which looks at the camp in its entirety and what was going on, the social dynamics and things. And it caught my attention because I was reading something about the football and then it went on to something else, and it just had this throwaway comment about how the camp members were freely having relationships with each other, and then it doesn't mention it again for the rest of the book. So I got in touch with the publisher and ended up having Ken Free, the author, phone me and have a chat, and it turns out that he had spoken to one of the prison members, so one of the people who had been a prisoner there, and the account came from him that he had observed these relationships going on specifically in the theatre that was at the camp, which is unsurprising. But it was known that those who were part of the theatre in the camp, again, all male, would have relationships with one another, and it would be completely accepted, and it was seen. And in fact, we have a woodcut print in our collection, which I often bring out when I'm talking about this, which, although we don't know who these people were or what it is, it's these two men, and so they're both smoking, and they're sharing, so one of them's lighting the other person's cigarette with their cigarette sort of thing, which is quite an intimate scene, I think. And the fact that we know that these things were going on, I do wonder whether that was the artist who did these prints, who was in the camp himself, was capturing these kind of relationships that were going on, because most of the other prints are just generic daily life kind of stuff. So we've just had our collections online go up, and for LGBT History Month, I'm curating a group of our LGBT collections that will be going out as a kind of thing for people to look at. So that will be in there.
Let's swing back. We've got these kind of situational sexualities on the ships, which my understanding, and feel free to sort of correct me here, is the idea that in much the same way as we talk about, you mentioned earlier, the actions rather than, say, the sexuality, like a same-sex relationship rather than a gay man, for example. Yeah. The situational sexualities, it's we often use it as a same-sex environment primarily. So, yeah, the Navy being an example that you gave there, prisoner of war camp, because obviously all the soldiers were men, and I guess pirate ships. So there's a sexuality that is built on that specific situation, whereas once someone moves away from that situation, that sexuality might not continue. So I guess a modern example, and perhaps not inaccurate, but is often stereotyped and often in a very unpleasant way, which, to clarify, I don't think is necessarily accurate, would be prison, and modern prison. Even something like Orange is the New Black, for example, shows a lot of examples of same-sex relationships happening in the all-female prison, even though some of the characters themselves would identify as straight and are married to men and have kids outside.
Yes, definitely. There are very few named people that we know of who would kind of fall under the LGBT umbrella within the pirate world, but we do have some. And again, I think that one of the issues that we have understanding who these people were is the terminology used at the time. So like I said, they wouldn't have said gay, lesbian, bi, whatever. There are certain kind of words that we use. So one good example that I'll kind of touch on now. There was a captain called Robert Culliford. He's one of the more well-known, in air quotes, gay pirates. So he lived a life of piracy. He was actually on the crew with Captain Kidd, who is a quite well-known pirate, one of the more famous ones. There's a pub in Wapping in London named after him. He was on his crew and he actually mutinied against Captain Kidd, and kind of he has his own history about what he did and whatever. But what happened was he settled down on an island near Madagascar called Saint-Marie, and he settled down with a man called John Swan, and John Swan was referred to as his great consort. So consort at the time could be used to refer to, if you have a pirate captain, their kind of secondary captains were called their consorts. But in this situation, we're talking about them settling down on land, living a life together, and he was called a consort. So historians have classically kind of looked at him, and also John Swan wasn't really a captain. He wasn't involved in any of the piracy stuff that happened before. So there's this terminology being used that historians have kind of glossed over in the past. They're like, oh, consort. Oh, he must have been just because he was a captain. It's fine. But actually, if you look at it and its kind of context in which it's being used as to how they were living, you could infer quite a lot more from it.
Yeah, I was literally about to ask that. Was there language available at the time? Do you reckon? I have no idea if you know. And they just kind of went, we're not going to engage with that. Let's use this kind of euphemistic consort. Or was it literally the language didn't exist and they were like, we're not sure what to use. I guess consort's probably the closest? Or I have no idea.
Yeah, because I think when you look at written records that talk about explicit homosexuality and things like that at the time, it's mostly in plays, poems, and things that are meant to be kind of quite inflammatory. So they'll use offensive words and things like that. In a similar way, I guess, like how members of, I think specifically the gay community today, will reclaim certain words that have historically been offensive to them. Much the same back then, there were terms that would be offensive towards what were perceived as gay men. They would use them about themselves. And yeah, there were a few. This isn't an area I'm particularly familiar with.
So to clarify, like, we're essentially talking about the old term equivalent of faggot.
Or even like queer. Now, queer at one point was offensive, and now we're using it today, reclaiming it, etc. So a lot of the written records that discuss same-sex identities and things were often parts of kind of plays and things where they were meant to be inflammatory and kind of provocative, and often about royalty and things like that. I know there was a play about Charles I, and it was kind of using quite crude language to describe his relationships with men and things like that. Whereas when you've got something like this, where it was an account of an individual at the time saying, oh, and he was a consort of blah, blah, blah. Like you say, I think it was basically them trying to use the words that they could to make sense of it. But there's no criticism within that account. There's no criticism of kind of like, oh, and he lived with this man. How awful was that? It was just kind of like, oh, and this happened. So after that, Culliford decided he wanted to go back to piracy, and Swan didn't. And so Culliford went off and left him and went back to sailing the seas, and Swan was left behind. Although possibly escaped to the Americas, but we're not really sure what happened to him afterwards.
Okay, wow. How long were they together?
I think it was like 4 months.
Oh, wow.
Which is quite long for a gay relationship, in my experience. They weren't together long. Their relationship, whatever it was like, was very kind of short-lived. They'd been together, in a sense, for a while before then, as in Swan had been on Culliford's crew for a while. I think it was I was going to use the word rescued. I don't think it was rescued. I think Culliford attacked a ship and Swan joined his crew afterwards rather than being killed. And then they ended up developing this relationship, and they ended up settling on this island. Yeah, so they'd known each other a bit longer than the 4 months they were on the island, but a bit like lockdown, you spend a certain amount of time with another person, you might end up hating them. So yeah, so that's what kind of happened. But yeah, so that's, again, the terminology is quite tricky in understanding, and we know this goes back even further, and I think it continues into this period. But you have medieval accounts of same-sex relationships, quite explicit same-sex relationships that we know of. There's one account from, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but from the Ukraine, of a priest marrying a bishop or something like that, like these two kind of people who were high up in the church marrying each other, both men. But the terminology in it is talking about friendship and stuff. So even though there's a wedding, the terminology of the day was to use the word friendship and brotherhood and things like that, when actually it's just two men getting married to each other.
Sounds like they're a really conservative aunt at dinner, like, oh, this is just a friend.
Yeah.
Invite your friend along.
Yeah. But then it goes on to the next sentence and says like bonds of love eternal and stuff like that. And so it's like this mixture of terminology being used. Like, as a modern straight historian reading that will be like, oh, they were just brothers, it's fine. But for us kind of reading into the context, it's like, oh, but this was a wedding. They were getting married.
So I guess this is one of those moments where the kind of euphemistic sort of glossing over, I think was the term you used, which I would agree with, of these sort of, I guess, queer histories. Once again, it's just an act of erasure of sorts here. I want to swing back because I'm fascinated again by these pirates. I've moved on from the vagabonds and now onto the pirates. So we've got this kind of Robert Culliford, I think you called him, and John Swan settling down on Saint Marie near Madagascar. I hope I got all of that right. Yes, I did. He's nodding at me for those of you listening with a big grin on his face. I'm very happy I got that. So we've got this one. What other accounts are there? Like, what other kind of, I guess, again, this is perhaps my own lack of terminology here, but what other queer relationships can you kind of point to, or evidence, or was it anecdotal, or what? Like, spill the tea.
Yeah, so I think one of the ones that's been most recently in kind of the news, as it were, is the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So they recently unveiled a sculpture in London of these two women, kind of immortalizing their story. These were two women who grew up, they had very similar upbringings. Both were kind of born into, I guess you'd call, difficult circumstances, and perhaps the families weren't quite so keen to have a girl, shall we say.
Oh, are these like working class? Are we talking like aristocracy here? What do you mean by difficult, sorry?
Yeah, so I guess we'll start with Anne Bonny, who's perhaps slightly more well-known. She was born out of marriage. And so it was a lawyer and his maid who had this child. And so they kind of didn't want to kind of admit that they'd had that child. So they dressed Anne up as a boy and pretended that she was the son of someone else in the family, a distant relative, so that they could bring her up as a boy to kind of look after and whatever. And similarly, Mary had a similar thing. She was brought up as a boy.
I kind of like have to ask, like, did they fool anyone?
Apparently so. So the reason Mary was dressed up as a boy was because her mother wanted financial support from the mother-in-law, and the only way they'd get that, because without admitting that they'd had a baby kind of out of wedlock or whatever, she'd been passed off, I think, as a half-brother or something from a different family. So I guess if you're a boy at the time, you might have been able to get some financial support from the family because they were more willing to invest in boys. Whereas if it was a young girl, they would have said, "Oh, marry her off or send her to wherever." So so they were both brought up with their parents kind of encouraging them to dress and act like boys. And then Mary Read, she in fact ended up joining the infantry as a soldier in the Netherlands, I think, and went off as a man and ended up falling in love and marrying another soldier in that infantry. But then when that fell apart, she ended up going to the West Indies, which is where she joined a pirate crew over there. Her ship was attacked while she was sailing out to the Americas, to the West Indies, and she joined the crew of the pirate ship that attacked her.
Her ship was attacked. What ship was that? Was that a pirate ship?
I think it was probably like a merchant vessel or something. She wanted to leave Europe. She was still kind of in the garb of a male soldier. She headed off to the West Indies to find a new life. And I'm assuming it was en route rather than just as she was living there. But at some point, the ship she was on was attacked by pirates, and then she joined that pirate crew. And she carried on dressing as a man throughout this to be able to fit in, I think. So
what was the name she went under? Mary? Anne?
I think it was Mark Read. So I think she kept her surname. I'm sure it was Mark. I've read somewhere that it was Mark Read, so she didn't change it too much. That's kind of how she ended up in piracy. Now, Anne, like I say, similar situation. She'd been forced to dress up as a boy throughout a lot of her life. She ended up marrying a man, regardless, who was a sailor and a pirate, but a good pirate at the time, one of the kind of legal ones.
State-sanctioned piracy, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Called James Bonney. So then she became Anne Bonney. I can't remember what her birth name was. There's not a lot of written records about their early histories, I don't think, so we don't know much about their early life, but we know what happened once they'd kind of joined these pirate ships. So she ended up going out to the Caribbean with her husband, and it was in the Caribbean where she met a person who went by the nickname Calico Jack, which is Captain Jack, but Calico Jack. So I think his name was John Rackham was his real name, but he went by the name Calico Jack. And she met him and fell deeply and madly in love with him. And in fact, Calico Jack then went to Anne's husband and said, "Can I buy your wife?" He offered money to have Anne, and James Bonney said no, obviously, but Anne decided to run off with Calico Jack anyway.
This hilariously just makes me think of a story my mum told me. My dad was offered, I think it was like 13 camels for her when they went like abroad. And my dad was really considering it, and my mum was like, "Piss off, I'm worth more than 13." Like that, no, kind of absolutely not. Like, oh, okay, what can we bargain for her?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was more, it's odd. It's kind of like he was almost offering more to pay for the inconvenience of losing a wife rather than like not paying for her. It was like, here's some money because you're not going to have a cleaner anymore. That sort of attitude was the thing.
Wow.
I guess it was kind of pitched as. But James was like, no, I don't want that. But yeah, Anne ran off with him anyway. And it was Calico Jack's crew that Mary Read was on. So Mary and Anne met on the ship of Calico Jack, both dressed as men. Jack knew that Anne was a woman, but he was like, if you're coming on my crew, the crew aren't going to be happy with a woman on the ship, and they're probably going to try and sleep with you. So dress as a man and it will be fine. So Anne, who had already been familiar with this, dressed as a man. Mary was on there already dressed as a man. Jack didn't know that Mary was a woman. He thought she was a man. But what happened was, whilst on the ship, Anne fell in love with Mary. Both revealed to each other, probably not that way, but revealed that they were women somehow. And then started their own relationship. But what happened was Calico Jack was worried. He was like, well, this man, he thought, was trying it on with his woman. And they decided to reveal to Jack that Mary was also a woman. And so it was only the three of them that knew that these women were on the ship dressed as men.
I guess in theory there could have been more and no one else knew.
Well, quite, yeah.
I have a question here, which I don't know. I think this again might be my own kind of ignorance. So these two women were dressed as men in the nicest way. Like, how could you not tell?
Well, this is interesting. So the only other account that there kind of is of these people, the contemporary account, is of a woman who was captured by the pirates and was kept on their ship. And when their ship eventually got captured itself, and Mary, Anne and Jack were all sentenced and kind of captured for piracy. But this woman they had kind of imprisoned on their ship said very much that, like, they had massive tits. How could you not have known, in a more kind of eloquent 18th century way? I think she said something like their bust was so voluptuous that you could not have kind of mistook them for men or something like that. But yeah, so perhaps it would have been quite obvious. But equally, as I've said, with the same-sex relationships and things going on pirate ships already, there was a much more relaxed attitude to people. There was this tolerance. And I think the only reason, like I say, Jack wanted to pretend that Anne was a man was so that the other crew didn't try it on with her. But then they might have done anyway, so...
Yeah, I mean,
it's very confusing.
Of course, yeah, like, you know, it happened between Mary and Anne, you know, they both, you know, so this happened. The reason I asked this, my immediate thought was, were the clothes that they were wearing, like, I was thinking like super baggy or something, but then I thought, well, would they be wearing that if they were like in the Caribbean or something? Like, so did their clothes like hide this, or was it literally like you just didn't read the sexed body in the same way as we do now? We don't look at, I mean, as you put it, like a voluptuous bust and go, well, that belongs to a woman, which is how society tends to read this. And I'm aware of the nuances behind this, everyone. So please bear with this slightly reductive conversation for the purposes of this. Is there, whereas they just were like, oh, that's just a person with a bust. Oh, well, cool. Trying to get my head around the vibe that was on these ships, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's very much it. It was kind of, you were part of a crew, all the crew were seen as kind of working towards the goal of piracy, and everyone had their own place and things like that. And the only time I guess there would have been any kind of contention and things like that was you actually did have eventually a thing in place that we would kind of consider as the equivalency of a civil partnership that developed. Pirates would essentially marry each other.
When we're talking about this, are we talking about state-sanctioned piracy? Because I can't imagine it did there. Are we talking like kind of like criminal piracy?
Yeah, this is amongst the pirate ships of the kind of later periods where they're doing it against the state. So yeah, so it was called matelotage. So a matelot is a bunkmate, so someone in a ship who's kind of your top and bottom of a bunk, as it were. So matelotage is where you have this union between bunkmates, but they might not have been literally sleeping on top of each other. As I've already mentioned, it was very dangerous being a pirate at any period, or being on the seas in general at any period. If you were to die, the wealth you had accumulated would go to your matelot.
In my mind, I'd always assumed that you were just kind of randomly assigned. Could it just be like luck of the draw who you got, or did you kind of be like, no, I like you, I want a bunk with you?
I used the word bunkmate because that's the term they used. It's not like you'd be allocated a bunk and be like, right, you have to marry Dave above you. It's a term that they used to kind of contextualize this union. So you could have married someone who's several bunks along, but because you were marrying, they called them bunkmates.
Right.
Which is also interesting because that is where the word matey later on comes from.
Oh!
A pirate who's calling someone else a mate is basically saying that they're same-sex partner.
Well, I mean, I guess the word mate is both a verb and a noun, is using that.
Mate that we use it now comes from that too, but obviously it's been abstracted quite a lot.
Yeah, the queer history of the word. All right, mate.
Yeah, all these like geezers down the pub are actually...
Oh, you want to give that bunk, mate? You want to give me a quick shag behind the bunk?
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly more nuanced than that because we know that there was these sort of arrangements between captains and their entire crews as well. So it wasn't necessarily that a captain would be sleeping with their entire crew, but they would have this kind of agreement with the crew saying that if I die as a captain, you can have all my wealth. And that's often kind of lumped in with the same procedures.
So I guess in some sense that kind of that arrangement then was, I guess, also a kind of, I guess, a sense of loyalty. You know, if I go, I bequeath this to you all, stay loyal to me, and this is your reward if something happens, kind of thing.
Yeah, but like I say, it was kind of lumped in with these other individuals who did have this kind of matelotage. But then the fact that we know that there were people like Anne and Mary and Robert Culliford and all these people who were supposedly having these relationships with people of the same sex, there must have been those things going on as well amongst kind of two individuals. This is, again, how, like, historic erasure is that historians will have seen, captains gave wealth to their crew, so that must have been the arrangement that they had. And when they've seen these same relationships between individuals, they've said, it's probably just the same. They were just mates. They were literally, but they just gave their friend their wealth when they died. There was nothing more to it. It must have just been that.
Again, it's the conservative aunt, isn't it? With the, he's just bringing a friend for dinner.
Yeah.
They've been a best mate for the past 10 years, love. You know, like, come on. It's not just a phase. Okay. I actually had another question based on this. And again, I guess this is more of a question of practicality, just me trying to get my head around it. In my mind, I've got this idea of, Calico Jack's ship. We've got Anne and Mary, or, Mark and whatever name Anne went by. Is there not a question of surely at some point nudity took place? Even if there was a case of just taking off your shirt whilst working or washing, how dirty were these pirates if they weren't washing?
So that is something that is often discussed in the modern historic assessments of those two individuals in particular. As you say, if they were to take off their shirts, it would have been quite obvious perhaps that they were women. Without modern nuance, they would have said tits, woman, done. That's something that is kind of the barrier that often historians have nowadays, is kind of understanding, well, surely there was a moment. Surely there's a penny drop moment. And especially if that one account of that woman who was imprisoned there noticed, surely everyone else was able to see at some point. But we just don't know. I mean, in terms of hygiene on a ship, it probably was awful. Not going to lie. I doubt they were.
Yeah, I'm not envisaging something beautiful here, but I'm surely at some point, just to go into another practicality, and this is taking a turn far from what I imagine this podcast going to the toilet.
Yeah.
Simply going to the toilet. How did that work? Because in my mind, I was like, oh, if you've got a penis, just piss over the edge of the ship.
Yeah, well, this is private toilets didn't even exist until much later in history. Everyone would have just pissed and chat together, in these communal areas, or like you say, over the side or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. We don't know. It's something that has kind of eluded us. And without the accounts of those individuals, again, much like previously, all of these accounts are coming from observers outside. So we're seeing what they observed as these interactions between these people. Maybe everyone did know.
This is what I was going to say, because you mentioned earlier, Calico Jack didn't know that Mark was actually Mary. Well, the question there was, did he actually? And was it simply just, we just didn't care, but, for the sake of, I've got an all-male ship crew because that's the done thing. And actually, you know what? There's 5 women on there, all perfectly capable of doing the same job. But he's just I don't give a shit as long as you can do the job.
Yeah, and equally, if the observers who are writing these accounts are straight cis equivalent people of the time, they're probably well, of course the other men would have found it offensive to have a woman on the ship, so they must not have known. That's the other thinking, is that someone observing from the outside would think how horrific it would be to have a woman on the ship, so surely the only reason it was allowed was because none of the men knew. That must be the only reason that it happened. They must have been so well disguised that none of the men knew what was going on.
We're already talking about people who are at the fringes of society and less likely to care because they could disrupt the status quo because they were not the status quo.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So, yeah, I like the idea, and I can believe the idea, I guess, Ben, of people from the status quo looking at it and going, well, no, I would never tolerate this. Therefore, no one would tolerate this in that kind of ridiculous way that people do. I mean, I guess my question to you is, have you got any other stories or anything else? I think you've picked up on these two amazing kind of backgrounds. Well, you've covered Vagabonds, you've covered Robert Culliford and John Swan, you've got Anne Bonny, Mary Read, we've got Calico Jack, we've got, I'm loving this. Please tell me you've got more.
Yeah, so I guess in relation to that whole tolerance thing, in the early days of piracy, in 1645, not quite early, but still kind of piracy had been established by then, but it was at the turning point of where it started to become illegal. A lot of pirates kind of established themselves on the island of Hispaniola. So Hispaniola is what today is Cuba and the Dominican Republic. So before the island was separated into those two states, it was one island called Hispaniola, and there's a smaller island off of that called Tortuga, and that was the island where a lot of the pirates would kind of gather and meet and rest.
Are we talking small, like the size of, like a sand pit? Or are we talking, small as in the size of Greater London, but small comparative to something like the Americas?
Images that I've seen on maps, I'd say Isle of Wight size. Substantial island, you could do it in a day. It's not like Britain. It's just a littler island. So basically, all you would have really had is maybe one or two little pockets of living. So today, there's basically nothing there really. I think it's very kind of, I don't know if mountainous is the right word, but the terrain is rough. So you wouldn't really have a lot of people living there. But at the time, it was just a place where you could stop and rest and recover your crew and whatever. Tortuga was mentioned in the Pirates of the Caribbean film as the kind of pirate hub. So if you kind of watch the films, not that it's an accurate representation, but that's the sort of like vibe that you'd have all these pirates from different crews gathering together and whatever.
So just to jump in quickly, I've done a quick Google search. It is 69 square miles, and in 2003, obviously we nowhere near this then, it had a population of just under 26,000. It's now part of Haiti. So it was mentioned in the Pirates of the Caribbean film, you said?
Yes, it was. Yes. So it's this kind of place where pirates of different crews would come together and rest and recover and whatever.
Was there kind of a truce on the island? Or was it a kind of someone's turned up. I don't like you. Kill.
There would have been fighting. There would have been conflict. And again, I think in the films, they kind of show it as that. It's like, there's a sort of peace, but obviously these are pirates, so anything goes. But it was just kind of a known place outside of the states of the world. So Britain, France, Spain, all those other places. Is a place that's neutral relatively, that they could go to and not worry about British coming to kind of steal all their stuff or whatever.
A non-state sanctioned place.
Yes, it was one of those sorts of places. So it was a kind of a neutral zone that the pirates could go to. And I'm assuming the British and others didn't know about. Well, no, actually, that's a lie, because it's just of what I'm just about to tell you about. So the French knew that the pirates gathered here, and they were so offended by this idea of these all-male crews having sex with one another. They sent a ship full of female prostitutes to the island, I guess in the idea being to turn them. But what happened is you just ended up having this massive bisexual orgy that happened on the island, because all the prostitutes were there, the men were there. This is, again, talking about kind of same-sex relationships in the past. A lot of the men that were in relationship with men might have been bi. We don't know. But that kind of proved the point with Tortuga, is that all these men who were having relationships with men or having sex with men ended up having sex with the women as well, because now they were there, so why not? But it was just such an oversight from the French. Again, like the onlooker saying, well, of course, this must be horrific, and if we just give them women, they'll be fine.
It's amazing. It's brilliant. This is that debauched ship, that, you know, the boat that rocks kind of.
Yeah.
I don't even know where to begin. So, like, you just had this, like, crew of prostitutes basically rock up and just sort of chill there and, like, you know, get business where they could and just, like, live there. But in terms of actually stopping anything, obviously it was completely ineffectual.
I'm assuming the French paid them for their services, as it were. I'm assuming the crew, the ship was crewed by French sailors. They could have been like sailors as well,
dressed as men, so no one knew. Obviously,
I mean, this is a classic thing throughout history. This is fascinating. That kind of keeps coming back at different periods in history. It does make you wonder how much of it is the modern cis historian applying these kind of notions and stuff to the past, as opposed to what was actually going on. Like the most famous one being with the Spartans. Spartans were renowned for having kind of same-sex relationships and stuff, but of course, to keep the generations going, men had to marry women, and so they would have children. But there's this kind of supposed tradition of the Spartan woman on the wedding night would dress up as a man, because that's all that the man had known. And so they'd get him massively drunk, dress the woman up as a man, and that's the only way possible that the man would have sex with the woman.
Which of course must be rubbish.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm not particularly a scholar of kind of Greek history, though it interests me and aspects of it interest me. I haven't looked into it too much myself, but it's commonly kind of cited as this thing that happened between Spartans, is that on their wedding night, that's what would happen. Obviously, even if that was an account, that would be a snapshot. That's one point in history that might have happened. Also, that might have been an account from Athenians who were like, oh, look at these effeminate Spartans. That's the only way they'll have sex with a woman, is if they dress as a man.
I was going to say, like, as well, like, how much of this was propaganda? Like, you know, we don't actually necessarily know the origins of these stories. In the same way, we don't necessarily know the origins of these stories about the pirates. It makes me think of, there was very, very recently, we're talking in the past year, there was a lot of research on queer fairy tales. Quite a famous book has been released. And apparently, basically, there used to be quite a lot of queer fairy tales out there. And then one guy who was responsible for transcribing it just went, ew, no. And transcribed all the non-queer ones. Very explicitly said that in his writing. These kind of grossed me out, like, because, you know, being a raging homophobe. So just didn't. And that's the one that happened to survive. So a new story was found from one of the ones they didn't transcribe called, I believe it's called The Dog and the Sailor. I haven't read it, but I believe it's an old, very traditional queer folktale
folklore stuff
that kind of covers this. And obviously, as you imagine, Sailor takes place on a ship, I understand. I mean, I might be mistaken.
The Owl and the Pussycat has has queer origins.
Oh, go on.
Can't remember the details, but I know, so I think it was Sasha Coward, who's kind of on Twitter. He's kind of does a lot of folklore, LGBT folklore stuff. So I'm sure he posted a thread about it last year. I think it was relating to the writer, and they were in a set-up marriage. So both of them were queer, I think. And so it was kind of established. And so The Owl and the Pussycat was about like an allegory of their kind of way of dealing with.
That's ringing a bell. Yeah.
That's another thing. I'm really interested in folklore, so I'd love to know what that book is, because I'd love to kind of.
I will double check. I mean, and anyone listening, please tweet us, tweet Queer Disrupt. I mean, we'd love to have this conversation. But I guess this kind of brings me to, I'm guessing more towards the end of our conversation here, but I kind of like want to talk about, like, if we have these difficult distances between things and between events, for want of a better phrase, and these stories, how do we tell these stories? How does that work? Because if we don't even have the language, or we literally can't be there in that place, as you said, some of these are just a snapshot. As an archaeologist, you're like telling stories through object. How do you kind of negotiate that perspective with accurately, in quotation marks, telling this?
I guess with a lot of caveats. That's how I do it. But I think the thing is, so my perspective, and I'll probably get hounded by other historians for this, but that's fine, because that's how I do it. For me, a lot of the work, especially around LGBT history, it's not so much as telling the facts, if that makes sense. Like, the facts are there, but it's about making it clear that history wasn't just white, cis, het, kind of the perspective that we have now. If you go to a museum, if you go to, and I will admit our museum currently is very much like that, and we're working to change it. But a lot of places where you learn about history, you will see this one-sided perspective, and just making it clear that there are alternatives. So even if it is like with Robert Culliford, with this complicated terminology of consort, it's kind of saying, well, it does say that, and some people have interpreted it as this. But have you thought about what it could have actually meant? Have you thought about this other perspective of what that relationship might have been? And there are examples where you can be explicit. We do know. So like, again, my strength is the Romans. We know the Emperor Hadrian had a male lover. We know lots of other emperors had male lovers, and it was recorded and it was accepted and it was fine. But in these periods where there's a bit more complexity, and again, when we're not looking at people in power, we're looking at the everyday people, we're looking at pirates, we're looking at these vagabond kind of vagrant groups where they don't have their own written records. It's kind of almost saying, well, it's stupid to think that there wouldn't be queer people there. Of course there were queer people there. They're bound to have existed. And sometimes these types of small subgroups within society facilitated and allowed that to be even more expressed.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I know Dan Vo, for example, does a lot on queer in museums. The co-founder and co-convener of Queer Disrupt, Hannah Ayres, who you've heard on other podcasts for sure. I've done one with them. They do a lot on queering the museum and looking at trans representation and historical trans representation in museums, which is really interesting. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there.
I think it does, like I mentioned at the beginning, it depends on your audience, really. Who are you telling these stories to? Like I say, if I'm telling it to a generic group of members of the public, I will use terms like gay, bisexual, lesbian to describe people, but then say, but also, just so you're aware, they wouldn't have used those terms, but it's because we know that she was a woman who had a relationship with a woman. And again, with the pirates, like, it was a all-male environment, so they didn't have the option of having sex with women. So maybe some of them were bisexual. And another thing, which we won't touch on today because this will go on forever, is the existence of asexuality in the past. That is something that I've kind of tried to kind of frame as well in some of the research that I've been doing. And because there's been this attempt, not that there's a criticism, but there's been an attempt by a lot of queer historians to look at examples of individuals who maybe never married and never had children. And that is the classic, oh, they must have been gay because they didn't want a woman or they didn't want a man. But actually, asexuality would have existed in the past too. And in many instances, this is what it was. It wasn't that they didn't have the opportunity to have sex with the people they wanted, because we know, even in times where it's persecuted, you'd find a way. You'd go down a back alley, or you'd find some way.
Ben talking about his last Friday night, clearly here.
That's the sort of thing you'd get around it. But the people who chose to live lives aromantically and asexually, they've almost been ignored. It's been written off as they were just an abnormality within society.
They may have been gay, they may have been lesbian, but we can't say that is what it was. No, it's a very fair point, actually. There has been a lot of focus, in particular, I think, on gay men and lesbians. Not as much consideration as there perhaps could be, or maybe needs to be, on the more minority sort of sexualities and genders on there. So I don't think I've ever heard, I mean, as someone who is non-binary, I don't think I've ever heard of a non-binary historical character. And actually, I don't think I've ever thought of it in that way either. That must have existed.
And that's where I kind of, at the beginning of the talk, I said when I talk about gender identity in the past, I talk about gender non-conforming. So it's this idea that the person wasn't conforming to the binary at the time. Doesn't mean they were trans necessarily. They could have been non-binary. They could have been a whole host of different...
Or what we would call non-binary today. But
yes,
of course,
what we would...
Yeah.
Exactly. It's what we would consider as... And that's why I will use those terms when I'm talking to members of the public, because that's what they will understand. But in terms of contextualizing it, as to try and get a more accurate representation of, like you say, what it actually was, what was the fact, what were they, that's when we start to have to be a little bit more vague about those kinds of terms, because we don't know in all instances.
This reminds me of a lecture I gave, and just a casual plug here. It's available online, IB Profane's Dragged Through History. And I talk a lot about how the term drag, at least in the way that we understand it now, is actually a really modern term, in as much as if we were to go back even to like just the 60s and 70s, drag was used as a catch-all term for example, trans people. Famously, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who are names people might know as some of the key members of Stonewall riots and the Gay Liberation Front, they identified as drag queens. Although, I mean, I've never presumed to label people, but I think a lot of people would view them as trans individuals now, rather than say drag, which does have a much more put on, put off kind of performance. I don't agree with this term, but like this kind of costuming sort of reading, there's a kind of collapsing of historical terms, I think, under sort of queer or drag or trans, as if that encapsulates everything and you lose that nuance there.
Yeah.
I guess I will kind of wrap up here. I mean, this has been genuinely fascinating. There's this amazing history which I just wasn't aware of, and I kind of didn't consider it existed. As you said, of course it existed. Obviously it did. I guess, do you have anything else to add? Throw out your social media if you want to talk about this. Mention, the kinds of things you're involved in. Have you got anything coming up that you're really excited about?
Yeah, so I guess starting with, I'm not a historian and this isn't my period. So some of the things I've said today might to some appear quite vague and brushed over and generalized, and they are very much so. So please do let me know if you either know more about any of these historical figures or the periods and things, because I'm always wanting to learn more about some of these people. So I'm on Twitter at Ben Paites. I'm sure in the text related to the podcast you'll see the spelling of my name because it's abnormal. But yeah, you can find me on there, and I'm always tweeting about stuff I'm doing through work and in my personal life and stuff, research about that. And I guess the one big thing coming up that will be interesting that kind of I'm working on, which will be available or hopefully whatever time this podcast does come out, I am, as I sort of mentioned, working on looking at the LGBT collections in the Colchester Museums collections. And at some point there will be a kind of data set of that available for people to kind of look at.
Can you give me a time period, or is it?
It's everything. It's everything. We've got stuff from the Romans up until the modern day. We've actually, one of the most, I think, really interesting figures from Colchester is from recent history is Richard Chopping, who illustrated the dust covers for the James Bond books. And he lived in Wivenhoe, which is kind of just next to Colchester. And he and his partner were the first people to have a civil partnership in Colchester.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. No, that sounds amazing. If you have any comments, we would love to hear them. And there can be sort of feedback on this. Drop us a line on Facebook at queer/disrupt, Twitter at queerdisrupt, or drop us an email. All of the details on that can be do the contact form at queerdisrupt.com. Again, I guess just one final amazing thank you to Ben for doing this. And yeah, I'll catch you when I catch you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this month's Queer Disrupt podcast. For more podcasts, check out our Spotify, Spreaker, and Apple Music account. We also have a YouTube account at Queer Disrupt, so please like and subscribe there. We have Twitter and Facebook, both at Queer Disrupt, so please give us a follow. And finally, our website is queerdisrupt.com, where you can stay up to date on all of our upcoming events and see what else we have to offer. Thanks again, and catch you next time.